want to welcome to the program Carl Beijer. That is a pseudonym. Carl, how would you describe? You have you're an essayist, a columnist.
Yeah, I'm an essayist, I would say. Yeah.
And where can people find your work? Obviously on Twitter, but
yeah.
And then where else can they read your stuff?
If you just go to my website at carlbeijer.com, that's CarlBeijer. And I'm also at Jacobin sometimes, a couple other places in these times, places like that.
All right, so here, let me just set the table as to why I wanted John, because you sent me a DM, and you're writing a piece that to cut. Well, why don't you tell us what the piece is, and then I'll read off the questions, because this is I thought it would be fun to just have this conversation on air. But tell us, give us just a sense of the piece you're going to write.
Okay, so honestly, it's barely even a piece. What I want to do is I was going around surveying journalists and policy people and other people, and just asking them some basic questions about socialism and where they come down on these issues. And they're just yes or no questions, basically, insofar as they feel like they can answer yes or no.
And that was the thing for me. This is harder, and I sort of want to. One of the things I'm interested in is just sort of exploring why I find it hard that way. But so here's the questions. One is, do you consider yourself a socialist? Two, do you think the economy should ultimately be subject to management through the state? Three, do you support the abolition of private property as opposed to personal property? And four, do you think that a capitalist economy ultimately can be reformed in a way that is reasonably non-exploitive of workers? All right. So one, the only one that I feel like I could answer yes or no was basically, do you consider yourself a socialist? I don't. I mean, I don't in general. Here, I don't. It was just I should have given it to you too. Oh. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's not. It was just
behind the scenes. I texted in our G chat, and someone sent that to me.
I will send. I will try and send it to you.
Okay.
But so, because I don't really. I mean, I've always been averse, or never found it necessary, really, to identify the specifics of my political project. I don't even think in that way. And I think if I was ever to call myself a socialist, I think socialists would get mad and say that I'm not. And I don't consider myself that way. But let's do this. Do you consider yourself a socialist, and why?
Yes, I do. And the reason why, so to me, it's straightforward. When we talk about, say, intersectional analysis of oppression, nobody has a problem calling themselves a feminist. Nobody has a problem calling themselves an anti-racist. All of these different kinds of oppression, it's very easy for them to say, yeah, I don't agree with this. But then when we start talking about the exploitation of workers and the oppression of workers, suddenly the question becomes very complicated, and people don't feel comfortable with saying, no, I oppose that. I am not okay with that. And, so when we talk about socialism, we're talking about a specific program to end these problems in much the same way as anti-racism is a specific program to end the problem of racism.
But for instance, I am against the exploitation of workers. I guess maybe it's, that takes us down to 4 when we talk about what reasonable means. But I feel like I'm against the exploitation of workers.
Okay.
I feel like the bar to socialism is higher. I mean, I don't. Mm-hmm. I mean, I probably, if I don't know, maybe I identify as a feminist. I probably would say I'm feministic. maybe. I mean, I tend not to do that anyways, but what, I mean, if I'm against the exploitation of workers, right? Really, I mean, by exploitation of workers, are we just talking about any type of like hiring relationship?
I mean, yeah, we're talking about just the extraction of their surplus value when they work. You know, they have worked for this and yet they don't get it because they're being exploited. And we're talking about all of the different conditions that emerge from capitalism, you know, terrible work conditions, long hours, all of the stuff that I would argue is a direct inevitable consequence of a capitalist economy. So for me, it's very straightforward to say, yes, I oppose these things, therefore I am a socialist.
So a good question might be, do you think exploitation of workers is inherent to is inextricable from capitalism?
Well, actually, that is the fourth question that he does ask.
Well, I skimmed it.
Hold on. But all right, so let's jump to well, I mean, I want to do the order that you have in there, Justice. So number 2, okay. So number 2, do you think the economy should ultimately be subject to management through the state? I think it already is subject. I think it's just the problem I would have with it right now is that it's managed for the benefit of the wrong people.
So we do have cases where the government simply is not allowed to do certain things with property. You know, we have rules about when eminent domain is and is not allowed to seize property. We have rules. I mean, that's like 90% of the law, right? Property is the law. So we do have all these rules that their major function is to restrict the government from exercising unlimited control over property. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't exercise any control over property. They obviously do, and they do it in a way that benefits the rich. But if the overwhelming majority of Americans today were to say something, were to make a decision like we want to tax the rich, which is extremely popular, or we want to, we want limits on gun control, which is a private property issue in a way. We can't do that. We have all of these limits in place in our government to prevent the Democratic majority from exercising unlimited control over property.
I mean, but isn't that, I mean, don't we have that as a function? That is the way in which the state is managing, right? Those things. Like, I mean, the state, in my mind, the state sets up this. It's not like some third party has created these rules. Although, you know, I suppose you could argue maybe with gun control. I mean, with the Second Amendment, you know, you could argue that like the Supreme Court has sort of imposed their interpretation on it, which was a fairly novel interpretation as of, you know, 15 years ago. But these laws, all of these laws come from the state, right? I mean, that's my point, is that, like, the state is managing it by saying we're going to, you know, setting up the system as if it was like a third party that created these laws.
Mm-hmm. That's where I think some of the ambiguity of these questions always comes in, because it becomes a question of, okay, it becomes a question of, to what extent are people exercising control over the economy through the state? So we have things like the Fourth Amendment, which limits unreasonable searches and seizures and stuff like that. And, you know, that doesn't just protect innocent people and good people. That also ends up protecting capital in a lot of ways. We cannot exercise control over property without overturning that amendment. So yeah, in theory, you could rewrite the Constitution, I suppose, have a constitutional convention or pass an amendment or whatever. And so you could say in that kind of, I think it's a very remote academic sense that people, that the state, people are exercising control over the economy through the state. But I would not say that, in fact, that's really what's going on. We have all of these institutionalized barriers that prevent that from happening.
So, so if you were to answer number two, do you think the economy should ultimately be subject to the management through the state? You would answer no.
No, I would answer yes, absolutely. I think that the state is the instrument through which people manage the economy, and I think that's not what is going on at this point. Because, yeah,
I see what you're saying. So the Constitution is in many respects the restraining the state as a manifestation of the will of the people.
that's what it was designed to do. That's what our government was designed to do, was to prevent the tyranny of the majority. James Madison was very explicit about that. And I think it works. I think it does exactly what it was intended to do.
Right. I mean, there's no doubt the Constitution was set up to protect property owners, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, without a doubt. I know. So
Well, Matt makes a good point in that, democratizing the state and making sure that it's a more direct democracy is probably needed first before any of those dominoes can fall. Would you agree, Carl?
I don't know what the order of operations is, honestly. I'm pretty agnostic about that. But when I think about socialism, a question that I ask is your end game here absolute democratic control of the state or not, or of property or not? And there are a lot of progressives who would say no, absolutely not. Elizabeth Warren, for example, she would say no. I'm a capitalist to my bones. I do not think that people should have this sort of unlimited control over what property is doing. There should be this institution of private property that is protected.
all right, fair enough. I mean, I still am not sure how I would answer that question. I mean, I think I see the Constitution as an extension of the state.
Mhm.
And I don't know if I would overthrow the entire Constitution, but there are definitely provisions I have a problem with, without a doubt. All right, well, let's go to number three. Do you support the abolition of private property as opposed to personal property? Will you just walk us through the distinction between private property and personal property?
So yeah, I think that the best way to understand it is it's a provisional distinction. And what that means is that, the state government in very, socialist countries, it's not like you have government bureaucrats controlling everybody's toothbrush. Or, in Norway, every single tiny little thing that goes on in its energy sector, you have kind of this broad high level management of what's going on. But then you have a lot of autonomy with what's going on with property. The government, people don't feel this need to control it. So when I talk about private property, what I say is, you should not have this absolute right, say, to control a plot of land. And if the entire rest of the world or the rest of the country says we need this land for such and such a reason, you don't have this private control over it, but you do have this sort of provisional control over it. The rest of the country isn't constantly telling you what to do with it. So it's not like this sort of what people imagine this communist dystopia is, where a government agent is coming and telling you when you can use the bathroom or when you can brush your teeth or all of this stuff. There is a provisional control of property, but then there's sort of a legal and authoritative de facto control of property that is going on by the people through the state, if that makes sense.
So in it does, I guess. Like I mean, I guess. So it is that ultimately the I guess I'm not sure I fully understand it. So it's
Okay.
so I mean, like we have eminent domain in this country, right? The state can the state can take your property. I mean, you know, Kelo said that the state could take the property if they want tax revenue. In this instance, or they think giving it to a different private entity will raise tax revenue. Is that the dynamic that you're saying? That like I'm not sure what the distinction of private property and personal property is there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, eminent domain is a kind of useful comparison the way that we talk about it, because while eminent domain does give sort of routes for the government to step in and under certain circumstances, if you're building a train and you need to cross property, or if you're building sewers or something like that, the government can do it. But the government can't just do it for any old reason, you know. If the Democratic majority just decided, you know, this field is beautiful, we want to preserve it, we don't want it ever to be developed. Well, you know, they don't necessarily always have the ability to do that. And we've seen that happen actually in a lot of cases. So what I would talk about in this case is private property should be understood as a sort of set of institutions and norms and laws that prevent the public from even possibly exercising control over property. Now, that doesn't mean that they do all the time, right? They aren't taking your toothbrush, but they have no opportunity in a lot of cases in this country. And in most countries, I would say it's all a matter of degree, right? So people are never exercising absolute control.
And I mean, I guess I always understood it as being like essentially private property was really just sort of like any type of property that is used to derive profits, right? Like that maybe like any type of like means of production. And personal property was the stuff that you actually use at any given point. Do I have that wrong?
Well, there are different ways of thinking about it. And I think it sort of depends on what aspect of the economy you're analyzing. But, you know, like Marx writes, freedom can only consist in this, that socialized man govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under their collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power. And he uses that kind of phrasing a lot. And what he's talking about is there's this problem under capitalism where the community cannot exercise rational control over the economy, over property, over what's going on. There are these weird limits that we've set in place to what they are and are not able to do. And so a big part of the abolition of private property is just tearing down these arbitrary limits that prevent people from doing that. And so if you do that, then you do end up throwing a wrench in the ability of capitalists to exploit your labor and things like that. But just the abolition of private property here is the first step.
So you're really abolishing the concept of any property that you own being protected from the state or as a manifestation of the will of the people.
Yes.
Okay. And and that can apply to anything, like my coffee mug, if I wanted it to, or the podcast, or the guy who owns this building.
I think it can. And that idea is obviously scary to people who imagine the government doing all kinds of horrible things with property that they want to think of as theirs and that they want to control. But I think that that is sort of the battlefield of politics, right? That is where where our task as people as socialists is to prevent the government from exercising this kind of tyrannical control and trying to make it function in rational ways rather than irrational ways. That's why Marx says, it talks about rational control.
How does that and there's no limiting principle, but how does it, right? I mean, that's the point.
Yeah.
There's no limiting principle. Yeah. How does that, what's the check on that though? I mean, I get it that we need to be rational, but there's no institutional check on that, or there's no tension. It's really just a function of our own rationality in that society.
I mean, even we shouldn't fool ourselves. Even when we build these institutional checks, we are sort of trying to exercise our rationality and saying, okay, this is a check that makes sense. This is a constraint on the government that makes sense. A problem with that comes up is a lot of times it's too rigid, and it becomes the set rule, and suddenly in cases it becomes irrational. So I think that the check on what the government can and cannot do is in the end always, it always has to do with the will of the people and what they are willing and not willing to push back against collectively. And I think that getting rid of private property demystifies that and makes the struggle over power, these struggles over property, very clear. And I think that's a good thing. It really exposes us to the sort of brute reality of what a lot of political struggle is. But I think that also gives us an opportunity to see it clearly and to manage it in a more rational way.
All right, that makes sense. Number 4, do you think that a capitalist economy ultimately can be reformed in a way that is reasonably non-exploitive of workers? What does reasonably mean here? That was one of my big questions.
Yeah. So, when you're engaged in any kind of collective endeavor, you are going to have situations where, say, somebody is working a little harder than usual. Maybe sometimes you might have a global pandemic, and suddenly nurses are required to work extremely long hours. And I think this is not ideal for them. It's not something they want to do, but I think everybody sort of understands this is just something that has to happen in a rational, functional society. So there are situations where workers are not always just doing exactly what they want and living in a utopia. In a sort of sane society, that's not happening. But I think that when you abolish private property and when they're controlling the means of production because of that, because it's collectively controlled, that exploitation is being minimized as much as possible in that sense, as much as they're able to minimize it.
So in other words, if it's a car factory, workers are going to have far more participation in the value of the output of that car factory. But there may be times where, like, we had a production run or we had a problem and we need, I'm just trying to sort of get into, that concept more as to like what reasonably constitutes.
Yeah. Well, I think again,
well, give me an example of unreasonable.
Unreasonable. I mean, an example of unreasonable is when you are manufacturing a commodity that society doesn't need just for somebody to get richer and wealthier, and really having more money than they need. And there are an infinite number of examples of that happening in our world. But socialism has to be able to accommodate situations like pandemics where nurses have to work hard, wartime economies, disasters, situations where it's less than ideal for workers. And that's why this is collectively managed by the state, by everybody, or everybody is managing it through the state, rather.
And what is, I mean, I think my answer to this would have been like, I tend to doubt it, but probably need to get further down the road with some of those reforms to make that assessment. Like, how much of all this is on a sliding scale, like a matter of degree? I mean, that was the tough part for me with, I think, a lot of the yes or no stuff was that, I mean, you cited Norway as being a socialist country, but there's some capitalism there, right?
Well, I mean, so, one way, for example, when we are talking about countries, you can talk about the degree to which they're socialized, say, through the percent of national wealth owned by the government. And Norway is a country where something like 55% of the national wealth, at least like as of 2014, was owned by the government. That's a lot. So, yeah, I do think like you do have to talk about there's no yes socialist, not socialist. Like, I don't think that makes sense. But I think as a person, or sort of as your own politics, what sort of makes you a socialist or not a socialist is that the direction that we want to move in towards 100% nationalization, towards the state owning and people collectively controlling all of this property? Or do you not actually want that to happen? Do you sort of pull back and stop short and say, we think that there should be private property that the demos does not have control over? I think that's what distinguishes a socialist from not a socialist, or at least a very major thing.
As opposed to a country which is more on a degree.
Yeah, I don't think it makes sense to sort of, I mean, as soon as we start talking about that, you start drawing arbitrary lines like, okay, what percentage of national wealth makes a country socialist? And some people have tried to do that before, but I don't think it really makes sense.
I see. Okay, because and give me a sense of like what that 55. I mean, because if I was to say like, well, I have no problem with 55%, let's say. I mean, I don't know what that constitutes in the context of Norway, but when I've always like thought about, I mean, for me, I tend to think of politics just like almost exclusively based upon outcomes. And so for me, like, I would like to see energy production. I would like to see the internet. I would like to see at least payments of healthcare, and I think probably maybe even delivery of healthcare ultimately nationalized. I don't know where I'm at now at that point in terms of like what that constitutes in terms of government, control of wealth at that point. But I gotta think that's close to energy, healthcare, transportation, in terms of like public transport or cars. Which one? I would say it's certainly public transport, like Amtrak and
do you think, like, would you like to see, okay, so for example, the government's already building highways, right? Like, we already have this elaborate system of roads that the government has created for the explicit purpose of letting people use cars and travel all over the place. So it's really more of a question here of, okay, well, how is the government going to deliver on this goal of being able to move people around, or being able to facilitate that? And I think that once you ask that question, you say, I say, well, whatever makes sense, whatever the majority of people decide makes sense. But the people should be able to decide that through the state. It shouldn't be left up to some random automaker who's just interested in his own profits making that decision. Because when that happens, you end up with all kinds of very strange situations, like, people delaying conversion to to electric cars and things like that. I think so. It's often a question like that of, okay, well, do you think that running this, is there a sensible way for this industry to be run? And why should any particular person be able to say, I think it should be run unsensibly, if the majority of people disagree?
But don't we have the ability right now through the state to do like cafe standards and to say, like, I mean, couldn't we say tomorrow, by, you guys got 5 years and it has to be all electric?
There are all kinds of restrictions to the government's ability to regulate things, and they'll take you to court and say that's unconstitutional.
But we do that, don't we? I mean, haven't we set cafe standards? So we set, like, I mean, it's just a question of, like, I mean, we could say, if we can say you need to have your fleet of cars needs to be average 40 miles per gallon, let's say. I don't know exactly what it is. It was just raised. 40 miles gallon. And if we can say 40 miles a gallon, we could say, like, you know what? Your fleet of cars needs to be 70 miles a gallon.
Yeah.
At that point, they're going to go, it's just easier for us to convert to electric. I mean, it's conceivable to me that we could say, like, your fleet of cars needs to be 200 miles per gallon, which, essentially is saying, like, you can have a little bit of, fossil fuel in there if you want, but it has to be electric beyond that. I mean, we have the ability to do that today.
So we do. It's more complicated than that. Like, when you try to impose these regulations, it depends on what kind of regulation you're trying to impose. And there are various tests that get applied for, is this reasonable or is this not? And a lot of times you'll just have like one or two judges who sit there and decide, okay, this is in the public interest, in my opinion. And so if the majority of people disagree with this one judge, they have no choice. And it gets the regulation gets thrown out, and it can't be applied because one judge has decided it's not in the public interest. One judge decides that, okay, these environmental standards, they're too onerous. They would hurt the bottom line of this company too much to be imposed on it. So I don't think that it's appropriate for us to impose these. We're throwing them out. And that kind of thing happens a lot.
No, without a doubt. Believe me. I mean, and we have, I think we're going to have a Supreme Court that's going to basically say, I mean, in the context of making that assessment, I mean, specific to this, the EPA, I think they've reversed that Trump rule about making that cost benefit analysis, but it could very well be inhibited by the Supreme Court. So a socialist country necessarily gets rid of judges that will assess. So how do we make sure that there's an efficiency of the country saying, and I don't know if in this country we would actually, frankly, we would all vote for, let's say, an all electric fleet of cars, but it is what it is at that point. How do we make sure that the will of the people is so efficiently manifested in our elected officials?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of room for disagreement there, and I think that I think that's essentially an administrative problem. How do we organize a government like this? So, for example, I think that having a Senate, which is based on this principle of protecting land ownership rather than people. I don't think it makes sense to have a kind of legislature like that. I do think that some kind of representative legislature does make sense, subject to elections and things like that. I think there are a lot of cases where direct democracy would be silly to solve that. I don't think that, frankly, a lot of people would want to be involved in direct democracy trying to solve a lot of questions. But the bottom line is there some way that, and some very reasonable way, that people can, if they really want to, make this decision about how the economy should be run, how this piece of property should be managed, and they're able to enact it through the state. I think that a lot of cases we don't.
If I don't believe that if there is like a way to efficiently do that, is it impossible for me to be a socialist?
I think that, so what I would say is I think most people do think that there is a way for the economy to be managed reasonably. Most Americans tend to think that, yeah, we have this system in place that does it. And so a lot of the controversy here about how you structure representation, like I said, is administrative. If you think that's just absolutely impossible, that sounds to me like the concept of governance is not possible, that we can't do that. And that is, I suppose that is a serious objection. I don't think that you could call yourself a socialist in this case. You would probably call yourself some kind of anarchist or whatever.
I just don't know that we can do it. I just don't know that we can have a system that is ever really going to efficiently communicate that. I mean, with that type of consolidation of power, that's my only concern. That's a big concern for me. I mean, for me, like, the thing I like about a 55% type of situation is that on the whole, I think that I am really skeptical that capitalism can eliminate worker exploitation, but I'm also concerned about all sorts of different systems not being exploitive in some fashion or another, or being, and so the closer we can get to some measure of tension, that I'm in favor of. It's not inconceivable to me that we get to 55% and I'm like, oh, 75% is looking pretty good from this 55% vantage. I guess maybe I'm in that respect,
I would say that sort of a persistent socialist position on this is that if you do not get to 100%, if you keep private capital and you keep the little concentrations of power that come with private capital, that eventually that 45% that is private property starts growing and taking back stuff from the commons, like we've seen all over the world, privatizing. And so in the end, you're kind of picking your poison in a sense, right? Do you want to be managed by these unaccountable corporations, or do you want to give democratic management a shot?
I think that last point you made about, any of it, if you leave any of it alive, it can metastasize is I think a fairly strong point. I mean, that is always that. I mean, and that is, then you look at something like, Piketty, and you see that maybe we're just reverting to the mean in some respect. But
Well, Carl, on that point, would leaving certain things in, like, I'm thinking about media versus the oil industry, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Like having some distance between the state, and I don't, I'm pretty much supportive of the state intervening, but is there anything in terms of that you would stress or emphasize?
Do you mean in terms of what the media, how the government would control the media? I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Oh, sorry. I muted myself for a second there. Yeah, I guess I think I'm generally of the like, you can't leave any of it, but I think there is a difference between leaving like the oil industry versus leaving media as, maybe a carve out, maybe because we have some sort of new version of the First Amendment after the revolution where, media is not as controlled by the state. But I don't know. What do you have any thoughts on distinctions between industries like that?
Yeah, so I think so for the media, we have this idea that, okay, a lot of people think that it's rational to have these to have this rule in place saying that the government can't control the media. We have a First Amendment in place that says that it can't do it. Is that what we want to lean on to protect media independence and media autonomy? Or do we want to lean on a population that values that values sort of liberal ideas about thought and speech and pluralism? So you're picking one strategy to protect it either way. And the only question is, which one are you relying on?
Oh, all right. All right. Well, so Carl, let me ask you. I think to a certain extent, I may be my perspective is certainly more legalistic than I think one would want for a
don't say.
a social. I think so. But all right. Let me ask you this: Is it possible for me to be a socialist and operate this podcast? I employ people on this podcast. Is that like? Am I DOA at that?
No, absolutely not. You're not the linchpin of capitalism. Okay. If you go away, capitalism is still going to be with us.
Whoa. You don't know that. No idea what sits behind these panels.
We are all participating in a capitalist economy, every one of us. There's no way outside of it. So the question is not whether you are participating in this economy. That's not what holds it up. If you're a socialist, you think that this class of extremely wealthy people are what's holding up the capitalist system. Not,
but am I not more capitalistic for the fact that I am higher, I hire workers on this show.
Is it your money?
Is it my money? What do you mean? Is it my money?
Well,
Is it coming out of your pocket, or do you have sponsors who are actually funding a media?
Ads. We have ads and members who support the show.
Right. Yeah. So there is this kind of structure in place that is paying the workers. I think that it's always tricky. You're getting into a kind of different question of how do we define classes and make a distinction between class or another. And you're asking me, do you belong to the capitalist class? My answer to that is I don't know much about your wealth and finances and things like that, but I would.
It's this show runs on the members and the ads that we read and that we have on YouTube.
Okay. If you lost all of that today, and could you just never work again and be fun?
If I never worked again today, would I have fun?
No. Would you be fine? Would you be okay? Do you need
financially?
Yeah.
Financially?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm getting close to retirement, but I'm not quite there.
So you do need to sell your labor to survive.
I mean, I think so. It probably depends on how long I live.
Because there are a lot of people out there who will never have to work a day again.
Yeah,
And that's it.
I don't know.
But that's what everybody would like.
That's what everybody would like. But that is a very important distinction. They're in a very different situation from somebody who ultimately, if you could not get work anywhere else, you might end up in a very sort of degrading and oppressive situation because you're working for a terrible employer just to get by.
Could get in any other work, to be honest with you. Sad to say, but that is. But yes, I mean, I definitely think I sell my labor. I mean, I'm here every day. People can watch me do it.
Mm-hmm. But what
the bathrooms.
But do you sell it? Do you sell it to survive? So you have people like Bill Gates, who is certainly working still in a sense, but he doesn't need to.
No, I understand. I will make you this vow, folks. If I don't need to work, I won't be here. But I'm getting old.
Yeah. I find that hard to believe. I think you enjoy it.
I enjoy it. I would probably enjoy it like a couple times a week.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Carl, this has been really interesting. I mean, now you understand like why I couldn't do yes or no on this. I just had too many questions, and I think like it is maybe a deficit of my mind that I just don't frame things in this way. But I don't know if that helps with the chart.
No, that's interesting. As a socialist, I want to frame things in that way. So what I'm interested in is, are there other journalists and policymakers and people like there who are thinking like me and who are thinking like a lot of socialists about this, or do they kind of have a different way of thinking about it, which may not sort of align with sort of a orthodox understanding of socialism?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm probably in the former, but maybe somewhere, maybe there's like yeah, I'm certainly, I think, open to it. I mean, I think just my sight is more limited, I think, just in terms of my vision on some level. And that may be a lack of imagination. But much appreciated, Carl. And folks can check out again. Will you give your website and your Twitter handle?
Yeah, they're both. So the name is Carl Beijer. That's CarlBeijer, and you can find me on Twitter under that name, one word, or you can go to carlbeijer.com, one word, and that's my site.
And you've been retired from basketball for a long time, right?
Yeah, a couple decades now. It's been a while.
Are you a Allen Iverson fan? This is my contribution to the conversation.
Am I an Allen Iverson fan? Yeah. I'm a massive Allen Iverson fan. I actually wrote an article about it, but he's just my hero. He's such an inspiring figure. I love him.
Yes, they did a good 30 for 30 on that.
Yes.
It's like I'm a Knicks fan, so I obviously I try not to root for him, but he's the man.
All right, Carl, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Good talking to you.
Talking to you too.